Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the second Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 10 or Proper 5, which this year falls on June 11th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, due to our readings for today, our deep dive today is on menstruation. And for those who may not be aware, what is menstruation? Well, it's a cyclical shedding of the uterine lining in order to get ready for a new time of fertility among those of us who have uteruses. And for the record, again, just in case there are people listening who don't already know this, no, we can't hold it in like we can when going to the bathroom, and no, this is not an infection of any kind. Also, folks who don't get periods should probably keep in mind that those who do probably are both less disconcerted by blood and also better at getting out bloodstains than you are, in terms of how do we talk about blood. Just saying.
Additionally, Kay and I have done our best and will continue to do our best to acknowledge and name the diversity of experiences of who actually gets their periods and what that can be like. Yes. And also, some of the articles and things that we link to don't always have that nuance through the whole thing. So sometimes they use the shorthand of women and those sorts of things when what they're really talking about is people who menstruate or those sorts of things. So just as a blanket disclaimer on the links, we did our best with them, and there's a limit because we can't write all the articles.
Which is probably for the best because sleep is important.
Yes, it is. Sleep.
Yeah. So we like to start, usually, with our deep dives of, historically speaking, how did people understand this? And historically speaking, when it comes to menstruation, a lot of doctors just, didn't. We have an article for you from JSTOR Daily on some of the wackier ideas out there. And for those of us who are familiar with some of the wackier ideas that were connected to menstruation, like, say, that whole wandering womb theory that dominated Europe for 150 years or something, these are going to be right in line with those. Yeah, there were some pretty silly ideas out there for a while. It took a surprisingly long time for us to figure out the whole it takes 9 months to gestate a baby thing. And in the Middle Ages and earlier than that, people didn't realize that they were pregnant until the baby started kicking sometimes because, historically speaking, periods weren't always super regular and you didn't always know why.
Mm-hmm. And they didn't have ultrasounds, which
right.
Helps to, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, historically, there's been some understandings and references, and this happens also in some fiction, historical fiction.
Oh, yeah.
Where they talk about moon cycles, and they kind of connect it to the moon, and that can work sometimes-ish.
Sure.
But also, historically, partly because they were maybe eating less meat, or the things that they did eat had fewer artificial hormones injected into them.
Yeah.
People would begin menstruation later than we do today, and it would usually be more spread out. And then add into that getting pregnant and having kids, and they just had far fewer periods because it was more spread out. So, we can harken back to those good old days. But
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have spoken to a number of people who have a uterus who, when asked, what historical time period would you like to travel to, simply answer, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And usually for reasons connected to this. Also the whole, human rights thing, but...
Yeah, but there is something if I were not going to get my period as much or as early, nothing else about those time periods is appealing.
Right.
But that is.
Especially the lack of painkillers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Also, there's a huge diversity of experience when it comes to periods and who actually gets their periods. So Some cisgender women get their periods, some transgender men get their periods, some non-binary people get their periods, and some trans women get their periods. It's more complicated and nuanced, but the reality is that like we all have cycles in some capacity, and a lot of them are connected to hormones. And so if someone is taking estrogen, or their body naturally produces estrogen, they're more likely to have a particular type of cycle compared to those who produce more testosterone or that sort of a thing. But there are cycles for all of us. It's just a matter of sometimes they include bleeding and sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's more complicated.
Also, if you are a person who menstruates and you find that you vomit, faint, or lose all ability to do literally anything for several hours a day on a regular basis while you're menstruating, please see a doctor until someone actually listens to you about that, because that is not something you have to put up with and is not normal.
Yeah.
And there are ways to help.
And you are likely to meet resistance because sexism in medicine is very strong. But please don't give up.
Yeah. Keep talking to people.
Also, if you're a doctor, pay attention and listen if somebody tells you that they're having problems like this.
Yeah.
That's the obvious.
Especially if you do not personally menstruate. Mm-hmm. Learn from those who do about what is and is not normal.
Yep.
Especially if you're in healthcare.
Yeah. Also, in different countries, it's handled differently. There was an article in Al Jazeera the other day about Pakistan, and there are some folks in Pakistan who are actually pushing in really cool ways for more access to period products. And this was brought into stark relief because of the flooding that happened last year. And so people started to actually talk about that and talk about what needs people had. But up until that point, and even still, there are more taboos around what's called quote unquote women's health. And so that includes talking about periods and kind of some taboos around that. And honestly, everywhere I know of has taboos around talking about menstruation. In this country, we really don't talk about it.
And we'll talk more about that later.
So when I'm talking about Pakistan, that's an individual country's example, but by no means is it the only example, and in no way is the United States less taboo about talking about menstrual health and that sort of thing.
Yeah, if I never have to listen to a straight cis white guy boomer be surprised that schoolgirls in Africa miss school because of lack of period products ever again, and are completely unaware that that same thing happens in America today, it will be too soon. Yeah. Also, for various reasons that don't bear exploring at this juncture, and also possibly I don't entirely remember, I have had a few conversations with Catholic priests in the last several years around this conversation. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, I want to point out that apparently, at least in recent years, Catholic priests have been getting some kind of official education on this topic. And the priests who I've spoken to have been able to talk about this without embarrassment and with a basic understanding of the biology involved that, frankly, not all of the cis guys I've talked to have had. Wow. And that's great. On the other hand, I also want to point out that that does not mean, if you are a cis guy, that you understand what people who menstruate go through, or that you have been there. And it's important to keep that in mind when you talk about these things. This is an experience you have not had. And while it's good that you're comfortable, there does come a point when you're, a little too comfortable in claiming that experience for your own, and that was frankly kind of weird. So, I was not expecting to have menstruation mansplained to me that day, but wow, that was not, wow. And not all of the conversation was like that, but there was a moment when it got very strange. So,
speaking of mansplaining menstruation, there have been, and I first encountered it in college because I was a women and gender studies major for one of my majors. There have been a couple articles written that are satires of if cis men could menstruate. Mm-hmm. And it is fairly well known that cisgender men have hormonal cycles.
Yes.
I don't think they...
Many of which they are unaware of.
I was going to say, I think most of them are unaware of them having them. But there are some wonderful satires of like, what would the world look like if cis men menstruated? Like, how would patriarchy and the approach to menstruation change? And there's a lot of really great like examples on that, both in terms of like, well, only men can be in the army because they know the schedule and the rigidness of like having a monthly cycle, and only they can bleed for the country. Mm-hmm. And there's also ones of like the justification for why men can be religious leaders, particularly Christian religious leaders, and other people can't, is like that. How can anyone who doesn't menstruate know what it is like to bleed for people the way that Jesus bled for people? It's just, like, it is hilarious. We'll link to 2 of the articles. Again, they mostly kind of forego clarification around gender and transgender, and if people are transgender or not. But yeah, it's some funny. It's been a while since we became robots. Yeah. And in that vein, there are some things that you do and don't have to put up with when you menstruate. So a reminder, you do not have to be in immense amounts of pain every month or every other month, depending on if you have one ovary that's worse than the other. You just don't have to. There's lots of options. And we'll get into like some more of that, but you are not required to be in pain. Also, there are some progressive organizations that are now giving monthly personal time. And the way it's phrased is like pretty open, but also pretty clear that like if you menstruate, there is intentionally built in opportunities for you to take time off so that you don't have to like work while you're not feeling great. So awesome. Also, if you have any control over that in your organization or where you work, that's a great thing to advocate for. It doesn't take a lot.
Sure.
Just do it.
And if we have any listeners whose organization does such a thing, we would love to hear from you about how that works.
Yeah.
Because it's still kind of unusual and also very cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also, for some of us, although certainly not all of us, hormonal birth control can be really helpful, both with irregular periods and super painful periods. We certainly acknowledge that that type of birth control isn't for everyone. There are a bunch of different types of birth control, and also we're not actually doing a deep dive on birth control today. But your bodily autonomy is important, and your ability to control your own health and your own medical situations are important. And right now, some states are frankly getting kind of awful about this, and plenty of countries have always been awful about this. Yeah. So that's a complicated subject. But frankly, and to be entirely honest, speaking from personal experience, only having to deal with this once every 3 months, if that, has been a miracle on so many levels. And I am only not R2D2ing myself because that's extra work for me. So.
Yeah.
Because I was absolutely one of those kids who, frankly, had to take a day off every month in high school because of that. Because I didn't have a choice, frankly.
Yeah. So. Part of why I like being part-time is that I have the flexibility that I can just rest.
Yeah.
And take it easy. And then another thing that people talk about, some people talk about it as the pink tax, because there is like markup that anything marketed towards women is marked up usually. Yeah. But there's also a period tax, which is more specific. And that is any taxes on menstrual products. And there are actually some states that are starting to get rid of sales tax on period products, which is great because
thank God
it already costs more just to exist as someone who menstruates because of needing these products. And it's similar to the way we've gotten rid of sales tax on food in most states, that you literally have to eat to live. And so we're not going to tax you on the things that are absolutely essential. So that's exciting. Also, a lot of companies like Tomboy X and Glad Rags and others have expanded their period products beyond what even just 5 to 10 years ago was very feminine looking stuff. But to have both leak-proof underwear and briefs, and to have a variety of patterns in reusable pads and stuff it's fantastic, and I'm only naming the ones that I am most familiar with, but there are actually a variety out there these days, which is really awesome. And a variety of sizes. Like Tomboy X has gotten a lot better at their sizing options as well. So, However, what is not great is if you menstruate in prison. So prisons are still mostly categorized by sex assigned at birth, which is problematic. So there are a variety of people in what is considered a women's prison who do and don't menstruate. It is awful and super dehumanizing to be incarcerated in general. And we've talked about that some in our deep dive into abolition with L. Dowd, which we'll link to that episode in our episode description. But to be incarcerated and to have your period while you're incarcerated is really problematic because there are frequently limited supplies. So most people are not given as many pads or tampons as they actually need. And so then they have to buy them at commissary at about 3 times the cost of what it would cost to buy it at like just your regular store. And some places have protections. Like there's the federal prisons announced about a year ago, I think, that you are guaranteed access to period products. But the federal prison system is not actually all that big. Like the majority of people who are incarcerated are incarcerated in state prisons, and those vary state to state. There are some states like Texas where there are no protections or provisions, and prisoners are not paid at all for the work that they do. And so that's where like having a $15 commissary charge every month is huge. And prison guards can require, for strip searches, can require you to take out your tampon, which depending on when you put it in, like can be really problematic. And they can ruin your tampons and your pads. And then like even when they are provided, sometimes you have to show that you have bled through your pad or that you have used your pad in order to get a new one. Or you might get the pads but not the underwear. There's so much that's really problematic. And there's 2 articles that we'll link to. One is specifically on periods in prison, and the other actually does like a 3-part series on, it's called The Period Project by Ms. Magazine, but it has one on schools and what it's like to be in schools, one on prisons, and one on poverty, what it's like to have your period when you're living in situations of poverty, because that is a whole other thing, partly because of the period tax, and then partly because of just like the systems we live in. People who don't have regular access to a laundromat or the funds for a laundromat might otherwise benefit from a reusable product so that they're not buying it all the time, but might not be able to clean it the way that it needs to be cleaned, and therefore it's not actually helpful. And so
And, to be honest, we could spend hours talking about the American public school system and the issues that are there, but we have a limited amount of time for this. So.
But speaking of that.
Yes. So let's talk about the various options that we have for managing menstrual periods. And frankly, I tend to think of this as blood management, but I know not everyone uses that term. And
I like it.
We will first talk about the modern options, and then we'll go into the more historical options. But I was definitely raised with the concept that the tampons versus pads dichotomy was the equivalent for people who menstruated to the boxers versus briefs conversation. Because people very often have a preference. So tampons are inserted directly into the vagina. They are not sex toys. They are, for many people, found to be kind of uncomfortable. And they also bring the risk of toxic shock syndrome, which actually, I think it sounds like modern generations who are entering puberty or going through early puberty seem to be less educated about that than we were, because I had a ton of people in my life trying to scare the crap out of me with that while I was a young teenager, just to make sure that I knew about the problem, because it was such an issue for people in the 70s, such a genuine risk that was really not educated about. And so I feel like the importance of understanding what toxic shock syndrome is and how to recognize it it is an issue. A lot of the symptoms very much resemble a flu, and so if you are on your period and using tampons and you feel like you have the flu, please just instantly switch to pads and see if it gets better. And seeing a doctor is not a bad plan.
Mm-hmm.
But those are one option.
Yeah, one of my cousins actually had toxic shock syndrome when I was younger, and so that was how I learned about it. And otherwise, I hadn't known about it. It's something that happens, especially if you have to improvise and create your own tampons because you are incarcerated and can't access them. So, periods are bad in prison and deadly, potentially. Yeah. But one of my favorite anecdotes of people who just common sense does not exist and kind of exposes how little education there is in our school systems and in health classes about periods. There is a song about Sally Ride the first time she went into space. And it's a fantastic song. We will link to it. It's hilarious. I could watch it 1,000,000 times probably. But it has to do with the literal rocket scientists who came to Sally Ride before her 1-week trip into space and asked her if 100 tampons would be enough.
And did not actually ask her if she would be menstruating at that time before asking that question.
Right.
For that matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was just like, this is hilarious. So we will definitely share that with you because it's hilarious. And I think it's a duo who sings it and who wrote it are just great. But yeah, 100 tampons.
It's an excellent song. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other common option these days for those who menstruate are disposable pads. And these, like tampons, do have different options, and these options are, frankly, a little easier to see on the packaging. You have wings versus not having wings versus overnight weight and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I just want to take a moment to point out for those who aren't menstruating, if you live with or are about to start living with someone who does, it is a perfectly normal ask for them to ask you to pick up some products for them. And so knowing the basics both about what they prefer and also how to find what they prefer in your local drugstore or grocery store is always a good choice. And for those who might be starting to menstruate soon and haven't yet, I'm not super big on doing a full-on, product placement ad or anything like that. But I will say that if you do want to try pads, I have found the brand Always to be ultimately superior to literally everything else I've tried.
Pretty much. Yep. They also have a version that's not as bulky and
Oh yeah, no, they have lots of great options and are just very reliable in terms of consistent quality, as opposed to some other brands that frankly have been disappointing. So
yeah. And if you are interested in a more sustainable option, using disposable products every month is ultimately more expensive than more sustainable options and also worse for the environment. And so there are actually several options depending on who you are and what you like. Reusable pads work really well. Most of them are cloth. Some of them are cloth with something to kind of stop you from bleeding through. Most reusable pads that I know of have optional inserts so that on heavier days you can have more protection. But some of them have something that stops it from bleeding through and some of them don't.
Oh, yes.
But those are fantastic. And companies like Glad Rags make variety packs. They make different sizes, all of that stuff. They also make a kit for folks who are about to get their period for the first time. So you can buy that preemptively for your child, presumably, or for a kid in your life. And that gives them the space to try it out and to be more familiar with it. And the care for them is kind of just soaking and then washing in the laundry as usual and not using any fabric softener with them.
Yep.
Yeah.
Another common option, another option that has slowly become more common have been menstrual cups. There are two kinds of these. The two popular brands are Diva cups or Luna cups. Diva cup, or as it was known back in the 70s when they first started making them out of, I think, just straight up rubber. That one was known as the Keeper. Those fit just directly into the lower vagina and are easily removable each time that you use the restroom and can be emptied that way. A Luna cup sits higher up in the channel close to the cervix, and it takes a little bit more flexibility to remove, but those are reusable and also quite easy to clean and don't take up much space. But you do have to be very comfortable with your body.
Yes. And part of, I think, for me, reusable stuff is also like it helps me be more comfortable and more aware of my body because it's just a different dynamic.
Sure.
None of these products, reusable or disposable, should be flushed down the toilet, for the record.
Right. The only thing you flush down the toilet is toilet paper.
Indeed. And then the other option is period underwear or period briefs. A lot of it comes as period underwear, but there's also, like Tomboy X does period briefs as well that have kind of an insert so that particularly for folks for whom, like, I don't know how better to say this, but like regular underwear shape can cause body dysphoria. Having briefs is helpful, but if you're also menstruating, it gives like a way to hold pads that are like snappable and stuff.
Yes.
But also is if you're not bleeding a lot, those can be really great. So especially if you have like hormonal birth control where you just get it a little bit, those can sometimes be all you need. And those, again, it's if you need to soak it, you can soak it and then just wash it in the laundry machine.
Yeah. The briefs can also be good for those who prefer a little bit more support of your abdominal area during that time. Mm-hmm. However, I would say that the one downside to that is that you have to be very careful with how you do your laundry for those because after a few washes, they can start getting kind of wrinkly and less effective unless you're very careful about how you wash them. There are also some, let's say, more unusual methods for blood management, and the couple we'll be mentioning are options I tend to think of as a little on the crunchy side in terms of who tends to like these. One of them is using sea sponges essentially as tampons. I want to enthusiastically encourage our audience to not use actual sea sponges because they have bacteria and like things inside them, and you don't want those in your body. So the people who try to encourage people to do this usually downplay or ignore that fact. But if these are actual sponges from the actual ocean, then there's no getting all that stuff out. There is no such thing as truly sanitizing them.
Yeah, just don't do that.
There are some places sand really does not belong.
It's true. It is super true. Also, free bleeding is a thing. I think I've mostly heard of it in the context of like protests or raising awareness, but it's where you don't use anything, any period products, disposable or reusable, and you just let yourself bleed and you bleed through clothes. And we'll talk more in a little bit about a more famous example of that, but that is an option. If you are going to do that and you're getting in someone else's car or sitting on furniture, you might just want to be conscious about that and careful about that and let people know so that you don't stain furniture on purpose.
So historically speaking, there have been a few different options for people for how to manage their menstrual period. And one of the better known things in terms of words that we have used but not actually understood what they meant kind of thing historically has been menstrual rags. This generally meant using a large swath of cloth, and as soon as humanity figured out how to weave cloth in order to be more absorbent, people with uteruses started using that absorbent cloth for this purpose, very often very similar to diaper quality cloth. And so when we talk about how these worked, remember that modern underwear really is an extremely modern invention, as in since like the 20s. And so so you'd basically have a large piece of rectangular cloth, maybe a couple of feet wide by 4 feet long or so. One of the short ends would be sewn onto the center of a long cloth belt that you'd tie around your waist with the cloth at the back. And you'd tie that around your hips, and it would be under all of your skirts and petticoats and your chemise and so forth, all your other layers. And then you would pull the cloth forward through your legs and up inside the belt, and then let it hang over outside. This method, it's also occasionally known as a menstrual apron, because it's sort of like an apron except backwards. This method can last for 12 hours, depending on how absorbent the cloth is. It really does not tend to leak at all. You would store the used ones in cold, salted water, that is, water with salt in it, until you're ready to wash several of them at once. And we can link to a video from the channel of Abby Cox on her experiment with using these for, I think, a couple of days. She found them super comfortable if you're already wearing a skirt that allows you to wear one. But these days, with the way that modern clothes are designed and meant to be worn, it's more unusual to have a skirt that would allow you to do this without it being super obvious to literally everyone around you. Also, I know that a super common question that is related to this is, how did people who wore those long historical skirts go to the bathroom? We can also link to a video from a channel called Prior Attire on that, but the short answer is basically backwards. You face the toilet, lift up the front of your skirts, step forward, and sit down. Because again, no modern underwear.
Yeah.
After that stage of history, once the skirts started getting tighter and shorter, back from, say, about the 40s to the 70s of the 1900s, which is a specification I'm going to have to keep making, and I'm still kind of angry about, because history being that... Anyway, because I should not be that old. I object to being that old, but I suppose it's better than the alternative. But back in the 40s to the 70s or so, as professionally and factory-made pads were starting to become a thing, you needed a period belt that basically took the place of that belt that the apron was attached to wear under your underwear to hold the front and the back ends of the pad, because they hadn't figured out the whole attaching the pad to the underwear with sticky stuff yet. And thankfully, these period belts started to get phased out in the late 70s to early 80s. But it was...
I did not realize
something
it was that close to when I was born.
Reason. Yeah, no, I just missed it myself.
Well, thanks be to God for that.
Yeah, and if you're interested in more history of how menstruation was managed, there is a, sadly, apparently abandoned website for the Museum of Menstruation, MUM, which we can also link you to.
Nice.
And they have a number of interesting articles.
Yeah. Also, some biblical takes. So,
sure.
The most obvious example that most people come up with is, in fact, the reason why we're doing this deep dive this week.
Yes.
Which is the woman with a hemorrhage for 12 years. So, first to clarify, there is no doubt in anyone who can menstruate's mind that this is not like blood spurting from her shoulder. This is menstrual blood. So, if this happens to you and it's more than a week, you should really talk to your doctor.
Yes, please.
But she's kind of one of the most clear examples. It comes up in Matthew, obviously, because that's what we're in today, but also in Mark. Matthew kind of changes some of the wording and stuff from the story, but Mark is the more original source for the story.
Right. Also, there are some mostly euphemized references in the Bible to the fact that in biblical Israel, women would use their time of menstruation as a time of separation from regular life. Mm-hmm. Those euphemisms are frankly pretty weird to us because this was 2,000 years ago and they used different ones than we do now. Mm-hmm. So they're not always super easy to recognize. But basically, this was a religious ritual that meant also taking a break from household chores and all of the expectations of the rest of your life, and you would get to rest during this time of your life. And this applied to, I believe, literally everyone who menstruated, which included servants and I think slaves as well. And so that was extraordinarily helpful for people who went through this.
Yes. Yeah, that's the space, right? Like when you don't have the things to like muscle your way through, then you have to rest. And so that like enforced rest.
When you're allowed to, yes. Because, of course, this was true for biblical servants and slaves, but it was not true for a lot of servants and slaves in other time periods and places.
Yep. And then some more contemporary pop culture takes. The Red Tent is actually historical fiction set in biblical times, but that story kind of retells the story of Dinah. I did not read it for a long time, and then I was like, I'm going to read it. And you know what? It was actually really good.
Cool.
So it is, as long as you know that it's fiction, right? Because otherwise you think it's retelling the story of...
at this point, almost every movie about the Bible is actually fiction because they won't make a literal, actual, properly accurate one. Not that historical accuracy is something we're good at in any context, but still.
Yeah. So it is the story of Dinah. Mm-hmm. And in that story, the main character, Dinah, and what at that time, I think they're all women, what they experience with menstruation and stuff is talked about pretty well, which is cool. Yeah.
For those of us who grew up with the book Anne of Green Gables, in that book, it is mentioned that Anne gets her period. It's just, again, in extremely euphemistic language that we don't necessarily recognize because this is historical fiction that was written much closer to that time period than we are now. In fact, when I tried to find the scene so that I could quote it for this episode, I was unable to because Google failed me. Because when you search for menstruation in Google, I think I searched for menstruation Anne of Green Gables, Google will search for both menstruation and period. And if you search for period and Anne of Green Gables, what you get is a ton of articles about the Edwardian era, which on the one hand makes sense and on the other hand was super unhelpful. But there is a bit during one of her summer school breaks when it kind of sounds like she gets a fit of the vapors or something.
I don't even know what that means.
A doctor will come to see her and says that she shouldn't do anything too physically stressful for a while. And so, again, super euphemistic language. I did not catch this until it was actually pointed out to me when I was much older. It really did just sound like she, got weak for a little while instead. Mm-hmm. But once you know what you're looking for, it's kind of obvious.
Yeah. Also, there was a marathon runner a few years ago who free bled for the whole race. She was on her period and she free bled for the whole race as a way of raising awareness because, again, there's so much taboo around. And I think that was in the UK. But there's just so much taboo around menstruation that it was this like, oh, right, people who run marathons menstruate. Yeah. And their menstrual cycle does not line up with races.
Right. And given that marathon runners have been known to, say, not take actual bathroom breaks, that's not actually that strange of a thing to do.
Yeah.
Also, I think one of my very first thoughts when we started figuring out what pop culture references we were going to make for this episode, one of the first thoughts I had was, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which is absolutely another book I grew up with. And guess where I learned about those weird period belts from a few decades ago? And a few other weird things that I thankfully had just missed because of my generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there are also a few kind of tropes of like, surprise getting your period when it happens by surprise, when it happens and like nobody's talked to you about it. There's like the man raising a child who's going to get their period and the guy's like, I don't know how to talk to my kid about this, right? Like that's one of those kinds of tropes. Also, the movie Turning Red is a Disney Pixar movie. It is fantastic. And it's a really cute way of like dealing with the like surprise and all of that stuff about like puberty and those sorts of changes. But then also like is just like a really cute family dynamic-y show. Yeah. And then of course the like bleeding through white pants or skirts. That I think is a trope and like has created a million nightmare scenarios and nightmares for people.
Oh, yes. And to be honest, all of these tropes exist because they do happen in real life. I have a family member who bled through white pants on a date.
Ooh. Yeah, I always am like real particular if I'm leading worship. I'm like, these are
I just straight up don't own white pants. I don't own because it's just easier.
True. Yeah. But like albs.
Oh yeah.
Always paranoid.
Absolutely. Yep. Very careful.
Yep.
Also, there was the Handmaid's Tale TV show, I think was the first time that I ever saw in a like professionally produced production of anything, a pair of underwear that had been bled on, because there's a brief moment where she has to show her bloodied underwear in order to receive menstrual products. And the weird part for me, as I reflect back on that, is that it was very clearly a pair of underwear that someone had carefully dropped some red dye onto, because it was perfectly clean and fresh otherwise. And that is just Hollywood in a nutshell for you. Yep. Also, Hollywood producers, menstrual blood, also just like any other kind of blood, will oxidize to brown. So for future reference.
Yep. And as Kay and I were talking about that, we're like, in like fantasies and dystopias, there's not a lot of acknowledgement of periods actually existing.
Right.
And that, furthers the taboo. So if you know of books that have menstruation as just kind of a part of it, the Graceling series is one of the few that I know of that have actually like people who menstruate in it. And that's both like they talk about the herbs that they use after sex to not get pregnant. They talk about as being also herbs that like slow your menstrual cycle. And one of the characters, specifically like the character Fire, her blood in general has like this particular thing that it does to certain animals. And so that then when she's menstruating, like she has to have extra protection and that sort of a thing. And then also in the Ember in the Ashes series, there's mention of the herbs that are necessary. It's a similar thing of like they slow down your menstrual cycle and they also keep you from getting pregnant. So.
Yeah, it is interesting how many fandoms of magical fiction will make up a magic spell that prevents you from getting pregnant or puts off your period for a certain amount of time, that kind of thing. Because, of course, the original fiction didn't bother, because why would you talk about that?
Yep.
And of course, I personally grew up with all commercials for any kind of menstrual product, but especially for pads, would use hilariously euphemistic blue water instead of anything else for what the pad was soaking up. And it just is deeply hilarious to me that we are that scared of what's actually going on. But I have always thought that it's the people who don't menstruate that are more freaked out by that and therefore need to be protected from
but like
from what's involved.
But the number of kids who like then when they do first get their period and it's not blue.
Oh, yeah, no, the confusion bloody? And the lack of education. It's still a problem in the real world and in America. Yeah, especially
defunding sex ed and
that's actually getting worse.
Creating abstinence.
Yeah, sex ed is important, kids. Helpful. Yeah. So we do have a couple of tips and tricks for you. I mean, there are the obvious things like NSAIDs are very helpful for a number of people and are usually more helpful than acetaminophen in terms of dealing with pain during your period. Because really, when you think about it, menstrual cramps are muscle cramps. And some people like Midol, some people don't. A lot of people don't realize that Midol does actually have caffeine in it. And so if you don't like caffeine for some reason, that's something you should be aware of.
Yeah. I will say, don't take muscle relaxers because your body
that is a whole different category.
Needs to do that. But anti-inflammatories, and that's where NSAIDs come in helpful, as anti-inflammatories. It keeps it from inflaming and pushing against other things, which is a lot of what cramping is from.
Yeah. And also, if you want to lessen cramping for not quite free, but pretty close, something I figured out several years ago is that if a day or two before your period starts, you start drinking extra water on top of the water you're already supposed to be drinking because hydration is good for you. So imagine that you are, of course, you always drink your 64 ounces of water every day that you're supposed to, which is not technically true, but pretty close for most of us. If you up that to like 80, 85 ounces of water a day, not to the point of poisoning yourself with water, which is apparently a thing that can happen if you drink truly extraordinary amounts of water, but like just extra, like a third more than you usually would. Your muscles over those couple of days before your period starts will get saturated with water and will not be able to cramp themselves as much because cramping is actually a sign of dehydration. And so if you just drink extra water for the first several days there, you will probably be more comfortable if cramping is a problem for you. Yes, you will spend more time in the bathroom, but guess what? You were going to spend more time in the bathroom anyway.
It's true. It's true. Also, heating pads are your friends.
Oh, yes.
Not everybody likes heating pads, uses heating pads. I am a big proponent. I had like rice pack or corn packs where you put them in the microwave.
Yeah.
But also plug-in heating pads. There are some that come in like a whole variety of sizes. There are some that are big enough that I can actually get like my back and my front all in one heating pad.
Sure.
It's amazing.
And if you're desperate, you can find disposable ones in the grocery store that sometimes smell kind of terrible, but are still super helpful.
It's true. Theraflu. And you can like stick them. You're not supposed to stick them onto your body, but you can stick them onto like your underwear.
Burning yourself is bad and unpleasant.
Yeah. You can stick them onto your underwear and stuff so that you still get. Yeah.
Okay.
Menstruation. Congrats. Now you know.
Yeah.
All the things.
Welcome to adulthood, folks, or whatever.
So let's get into the readings then.
Yay!
Our first reading is Hosea chapter 5, verse 15 through chapter 6, verse 6. God draws back from the chosen people who have not trusted in God, but instead have trusted in military might. God is more interested in action than quickly faded religious rituals. So one of the themes in this passage is this turning away from warmongering, that God doesn't want God's people to warmonger. So, here's looking to you, Congress, who's raising the debt ceiling with increased money for warmongering and decreased funding for things like making sure people don't starve.
Mm-hmm. Which is pretty biblical.
Yeah. God doesn't want us to warmonger. Don't do it.
God does want us to feed hungry people.
Yeah, do that. Let's focus on that. So in chapter 6, verse 1, we read the people's cry of, "Come, let us return to the everlasting, for it is God who has torn and who will heal us. God has struck down and will bind us up." And it is super easy to blame God, like humans frequently do, who specifically wasn't a fan of your warmongering for the pain and damage resulting from the warmongering. Also, the imagery that kept coming to mind was from a problematic movie that I watched in college in a couple different classes called The Gods Must Be Crazy. And in it, a Coke bottle falls out of the sky from some plane, and the people of a remote tribe in some part of Africa think that it's from the gods, and it basically like introduces, I don't know, selfishness into the tribe. It's like this whole thing, but there's this like, oh, the gods must be crazy for giving us this, and it's like, well, it's not actually from God.
Yeah. In verse 2, we read, "After 2 days, God will revive us. On the 3rd day, God will raise us up, that we may live before God." Wait, hang on. I feel like I've heard this timeline before. Where was it from? Was it from Aslan in Narnia, who, stole it from Jesus? I am still not over that. I am still angry at C.S. Lewis about this, because there is a giant thick line between homage and plagiarism, and Lewis crossed it with this. I am still frustrated about Aslan coming back from the dead after 3 days, because that was the most obvious thing that 9-year-old me had seen, and I was not impressed.
That's hilarious. And I love 9-year-old Kay. Adorbs.
Only book I've ever actually thrown across a room.
Nice.
So far.
I know, I was going to say, there's more time. There's time yet. And then in verse 3, we read, "Let us press on to know the everlasting, whose appearing is as sure as the dawn. God will come to us like the showers, like the spring rains that water the earth." And I definitely own a DVD of the Cinderella story, the version with Hilary Duff. And there's a line in this, it's set in Southern California during it, and there's a drought, and she's talking to the prince character, and she's like writing this like note that's like, "I'm done. I can't handle this, because waiting for you is like waiting for rain in this drought." And then like, as she's like walking away, he like quits his football game to come and kiss, spoilers, to come and kiss her. And right as they kiss, a drop of water lands on her face because it's starting to rain.
Imagery is awesome.
Yeah. It's adorable.
And then in verse 5, we read, "Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets, I have killed them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light." And I love this image of God having promised to not destroy humanity with this sign of the rainbow, which, by the way, happy Pride Month.
Woo woo.
Yeah. But I love this image of God having promised all that, just using words to, cut us down a little or prune us gently as necessary. And it reminds me of a scene in a Melanie Ron book. I think it's either the first or second book of the Dragon Prince trilogy, where there is this teenage kid who is a prince and is a little pompous with it and is playing with some like lower ranked kids and gets all stuffy with them and reminds them that he's a prince. And his aunt, I think, catches them during this conversation and sends the other kids off. And I don't remember the exact line she used because I couldn't find it before we recorded today. But it's something along the lines of, it's a pretty terrible prince who has to remind others that he's a prince. And he is just absolutely emotionally knocked over by this. And rightly so. And it kind of makes me think that that's probably the sort of thing that God tends to say to us, because we get in those moods pretty regularly. So,
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Our second reading for today is from Romans chapter 4, verses 13 through 25. While the universe is too diverse for God's law, as given in Scripture, to precisely apply to every situation forever, those who follow the Abrahamic faiths can do the best they can with what we know, and trust in God's grace and righteousness for the rest.
So one of the themes in this passage is Paul's convenient rewriting of reality/history.
A lot.
Paul does this a lot, but it definitely happens. But Abraham trusting in God, are we sure? Sometimes, but
here and there.
And it reminded me, for Horror Nerds at Church, we just watched Candyman, the original, and we watched the 2021 version. And it's fascinating because Candyman does that, right? There's a way that history and the story of Candyman changes, but they do it in a way that makes clear that the legend, there's continuity and difference, and so you can tell how the legend has evolved and changed, which is a really cool way of doing it in a way that also acknowledges that we have legends and legends change and evolve, unlike trying to actually take things like racism out of history books and pretending that Rosa Parks was just tired and didn't want to trade seats. Florida.
That's not how that works. And then in verse 14 we read, "If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void." And let's be clear, most systems of inheritance law through history in most of the cultures that I'm aware of have been pretty screwed up and broken. A lot of them have not worked well. But the only possible option that we haven't actually tried yet that I'm aware of that would actually be worse is the concept that inheritance law meant that the kid who best followed their parents' will got everything. That would be terrible. I'm imagining how Avatar: The Last Airbender would have worked out under that system, and Azula would have automatically become Fire Lady and not even had to work for it. And oh, gracious no. That is so bad. Every terrible family would become so much worse.
Yep. That's a great example. And then in verse 16 we read, "For this reason it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all Abraham's descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham, for he is the father of all of us." So don't be Islamophobic. It's in the Bible. They're your cousins.
Yeah.
Stop.
Absolutely. Pretty sure that also covers, don't be homophobic.
And don't be,
while we're at it.
And don't be anti-Semitic. All of those. All of us trace back to Isaac and Ishmael, who trace back to Abraham.
And then in verse 19a, we read, "Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old." And I might be on a little bit of a Avatar: The Last Airbender kick today, but I don't know that this is true. And I think there are a lot of people who would disagree with this statement, Abraham. And if you want to know, just ask King Boomy, because I don't think he's going to say that being old means that you're as good as dead. because he managed to do an awful lot of stuff while he was old.
Mm-hmm. Also, Aang was like frozen in ice for 100 years.
Sure.
And also, there's like a really fun like fan fiction alternate universe thing of Avatar if they hadn't found Aang.
Oh, I saw that.
And
yes.
like they had just pretended Katara was the next one. And then in verse 24 we read, "But for ours also it will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead." Okay, folks, pronouns matter and can really confuse things. I read that verse at least 3 times before realizing that it was not Abraham who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, but the him was God. This is a great argument and reasoning why using no pronouns for God, or they them pronouns for God, or literally anything but he him for God would have been super helpful in this moment.
Yes.
And also your reminder during Pride, as we do regular PSAs, we don't, but we're doing it right now, to respect people's pronouns. And God has a plethora of pronouns or no pronoun, not just one.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, hey, congratulations on not actually rewriting history for that one, Paul, once we figured out what on earth you were doing with the pronouns.
Right. Yeah. It took me...
To be fair, Abraham is not actually the one who raised Jesus from the dead.
It's true.
10 out of 10, very good.
But it definitely took me too long to figure out who we were talking about in that sentence.
Absolutely.
Then our gospel reading for this episode is Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13 and verses 18 through 26. Jesus calls Matthew the collector of Roman taxes to be a disciple and eats with him and other sinners. Then Jesus agrees to heal a young girl who has died, and on his way to her, a woman with a hemorrhage touches Jesus and is healed. Jesus brings the young girl back to life. So one of the themes in this passage is that it is a non-zero-sum healthcare world for Jesus. Everybody's needs can be met. The young girl who has died is healed. The woman with the hemorrhages is healed. It is not a competition, and it doesn't have to be. We can all benefit and all get the care we need. We actually have enough resources for it even today. We just have to not hoard them.
Right. Healthcare is not pie, although we do actually have enough pie for everyone too. So that metaphor no longer works.
That's true.
So in verse 9, we read, "As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and followed him." So it doesn't always hit me this way when I read this verse, I don't think, but the image of Jesus going through the phantom toll booth came to mind when I read this this time. Maybe it's because of calling it the tax booth, I guess. And given how words work in the Kingdom of Wisdom in the book The Phantom Toll Booth, or there is a movie version, which is pretty good, and given how good Jesus is with words and Jesus's kind of odd way with words in the Gospels, this would be a fantastic story, and I totally want to see what happens when Jesus goes to the Kingdom of Wisdom. That would be amazing.
I believe you. I don't think I ever watched, or I don't think I ever read The Phantom Toll Booth, so...
I believe I've recommended it to you before, possibly on this podcast.
I believe that.
It's all about twisting words and using them in interesting ways. Like there is the Half-Baked Ideas Bakery.
That sounds fantastic. I should really, should really read that book. Okay. And then in verse 12, we read that when people were grumbling about Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, when Jesus heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." Actually, that's technically not true. Lots of us need physicians and medical care for maintenance, preventative medicine, for reproductive health care, all of those things. So,
absolutely.
Maybe what Jesus is trying to say is, we just all are in need.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's more along the lines of those who can never become sick don't require healthcare, but everyone can. So we are all fallible.
Yeah.
And then in the first half of verse 20, we read, "Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. Okay, on the one hand, I am enthusiastically in favor of don't diagnose other people like that. Unless you are actually a medical professional and you are their medical professional, don't diagnose other people. bad
Mm-hmm.
idea.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, this woman has been dead for a couple of thousand years by now, and therefore this isn't actually going to hurt her. So diagnosing historical people is generally less harmful because you can't hurt them anymore.
Mm-hmm. And it can
I
sometimes be
realized that,
helpful.
yes, as we will get to in a moment, especially when it comes to recognizing that some issues have always existed and haven't just been recently made up.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that it is also super common to joke that when you feed symptoms into WebMD, it will always tell you that it is a tumor. You will always, always, always have a tumor or cancer of some kind. But I put her symptoms into the symptoms checker on WebMD, and it said it could be several things. Okay, one of them was a tumor. In fact, the first one was a tumor. But there were also other things on that list, such as fibroids, or a cervical polyp, or a condition that is apparently called dysfunctional uterine bleeding, which generally that kind of name for a condition means we don't know why this is happening, so we're just naming the symptom instead of figuring out what it is.
Yeah.
Which sounds weirdly similar to the kind of healthcare she probably got 2,000 years ago.
And the kind of healthcare that frequently people get today.
Yeah, strange how some things don't seem to be changing.
Or we could just call it hysteria.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
No. Hysteria comes from, like, uterus. It's this, like, oh, you're a woman, issues. You're crazy. Yeah. Yeah. And then the second half of that verse is that this woman came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his cloak. And so in this, we're talking about the Fringes, not, I believe there's a band called The Fringe or something, not them.
There was a TV show.
Maybe that. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about bangs. We're not talking about the outer rim planets in Firefly. More fringe-like, as in Buffy and her friends, right? Like if we're talking about the body of Christ and the fringe of Jesus' cloak, it's like Buffy and her friends, at least that first year. But they are not the included ones. They're not the cool ones.
Sure.
And yet that is where the healing and the magic happens. And I think about that a lot, especially in Pride Month, of the places where the healing and the magic happen for me a lot of the time are in the queer spaces, the fringes of the church. So, yeah.
And now it's time for our most periodic segment and consistently cyclical segment. Let's make a Muppets musical.
That was terribly funny.
Well, I wasn't going to say the bloodiest segment. It almost never is.
It's true.
So.
It's true. I was trying to think of who would be the sneakiest Muppet. Like, okay, we could cast Gonzo the Great as Jesus because the cape is perfect for a fringe for the woman to touch. But who would be the sneakiest one who could actually sneak? Like, part of me wants Beaker to be the one to, like, sneak up and try and touch, because
maybe
without a doubt, but a, like, little meep would, like, sneak out of Beaker's mouth right when Beaker touches the fringe, and that'd be hilarious.
Yes, but Beaker is very quiet when he's not meeping.
What about you? Who are you?
Well, I was going back to the New Testament reading about all of that, following the law and the adherence of the law and those who do not adhere to the law. And that just brings up Bert and Ernie. You know Bert and Ernie are going to be the obvious choices for that text as the examples of those who adhere to the law and those who don't. And they would have, well, Ernie would have a glorious time. I don't know that Bert would enjoy it quite as much as Ernie would, illustrating that process.
For the Romans reading?
For the Romans reading. Okay. For those who adhere to the law and those who do not. Yeah. Because Bert loves adhering to the law. And Ernie, probably knows that the laws exist. Probably. Sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Bert and Ernie would definitely be a great, example of that.
Also, Sesame Street, if you ever wanted to do, a sex ed movie or a Our Changing Bodies movie, you could do a great job with that, and that would be awesome. I'm just saying.
I was going to say, Sesame Street would do an amazing job in having actual conversations about, puberty and changing bodies and all of that.
Yeah.
I'd be here for it. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the third Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than buying a month's worth of menstrual supplies for a person who menstruates.
Truth.
Even without the extra sales tax.
Truth. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.